Today's event is co-sponsored by the Hamilton Library, the Spark M. Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the School of Communications, the Center for Oral History, and the Departments of Ethnic Studies, History, Anthropology, American Studies, and Political Science. And now I will turn things over to John Zern, co-editor of Biography and Interdisciplinary Quarterly and professor of English.
Aloha mai kako. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Logan Narikawa, who is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of American Studies here at UH Mānoa. As we'll be hearing about today, I think, his dissertation is exploring the ethical questions that constellate around the various historically embedded relationships among Hawaiians and settlers here in Hawaii. Logan comes to UH with a master's degree in Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School. And he came into the orbit of the Center for Biographical Research when he served as the production manager for the publication Value of Hawaii 2, for which we're very grateful for those efforts. Logan is also very active in the community. He is a board member of KAHEA, the Hawaiian Environmental Alliance. He's just started with a nonprofit organization called the Education Incubator. I've known Logan and heard him speak for a long time, and I'm very much looking forward to learning more about this exciting project. So please join me in welcoming Logan Narikawa.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate the introduction and appreciate everybody being here today. It's quite an honor to be part of the long line and lineage of the Biography Brown Bag series. And I am pretty nervous to see so many people in our Zoom space, and I'll sure get over that in a second. But a few notes, I will share screen and kind of walk you through what I'm doing today. As I do that, I hope it'll give some context for what I'm trying to walk through and accomplish during our time today. I want to leave a lot of time for interaction with you folks. This turns out to be something of a construction zone that you're encountering. I'm currently undertaking some revisions. I was going to say massive undertaking of revisions, but a reworking in any case of some of what you're seeing. So I'm gonna sort of jump around and show you different parts of my project and try my best to engage you and actually to ask for your engagement with my project that might actually help at this stage in its development. So the working title is An Ethics of Settler Decolonization in Hawai'i. And what I sort of centered around are 13 interview subjects who sit at the heart of this study. I'll name them because they are the sort of breadth of all of what I've done for academically anyway, for the past 6 or so years. And their names are Joel August, Mike Town, and Alan Murakami, Gwen Kim and Bart Dame, John Matsuoka, Gigi Kokio, Charlie Rappoon, Paul Rappoon, and John Rappoon, Ed Greevy, and Joan Lander, and finally John Wittick. Now, even if I was at the point where I could share a synthesis of all of what I had kind of thought of in reflection with these folks, we probably wouldn't have time for these 13 people. It's lucky number 13. So what I'm going to do is probably focus on 2 of these and show you different parts of kind of my thinking and my analysis and even my engagement with these folks. What I'm going to begin with, though, is what I'm calling an untimely meditation. And basically this is me trying to solicit your help in thinking through where I am at this stage of the dissertation process. I'm going to set up my project. I'm going to talk through what I think of as its kind of sticky points, the parts that have confounded me, and offer some of my reflections and actual process, and then turn it back to you folks and ask you to reflect, to critically engage, to sort of just think along with me. And a brief overview then of my time today. So if I could, just for a second, I need to ask for something in the background of me that's distracting. Sorry, as it turns out, the whole construction zone thing is because of our building is currently undergoing construction, and the noise is sometimes hard to deal with. So I will do my best to kind of power through. So those are my introductory remarks. What I want to do is walk you through my problem statement, my argument, and then a lot of time on method. I think this is a really fitting place to talk through method. Folks who have engaged in biographical study, you are my kind of core audience. Others who have thought through what it means to engage in other people's life stories and how to collect them, how to properly carry them, how to care for them as you comb through them and analyze them, and sort of the limits and the borders that one should observe and be aware of. And then the final part of today will be taking you through some fragments that, as I said before, are under revision, but what I think are, I would say, snapshots into my project and sort of what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. So the first thing that I'd like to do is to begin with my problem statement. So for non-Hawaiians, who make up over 90% of the population in Hawaii, political allegiance is a live question. To align oneself with the United States and uncritically claim American citizenship is to uphold the sovereignty of a political entity that traces its origins to the overthrow of the Hawaiian government in 1893 and the subsequent forced annexation of 1898. Given the de facto rule of the United States in Hawaii today, questions regarding the legality of US rule can appear moot, even those that acknowledge American wrongdoing are liable to suggest the impossibility of full redress in the face of the naked force of its military and the formidable might of its state and ideological apparatuses. US hegemony in Hawaii can take on an air of inevitability. For Hawaiians, resistance to foreign aggression cannot be separated from the expression of ea. The US seizure and occupation of Hawaii at the turn of the 19th century, like the rogue act of Naval Captain George Paulette to claim Hawaii for the British Empire in 1843, were not resisted by Kanaka solely reacting to colonial provocation. As Kauikeaʻuli, King Kamehameha III, proclaimed upon the restoration of Hawaiian sovereignty following the Paulette affair, "Ua mau ke eo ka aina i ka pono." That is, the sovereignty or ea of the land continues through just and proper acts. For Hawaiians, foreign incursion, whether by England or America, threatened and threatens the very balance of life in Hawaii. As sovereignty was and continues to be understood as a necessary ingredient in the sustenance of life, Hawaiians have resisted colonization as a matter of survival. On the other hand, while non-Hawaiians living in Hawaii would do well to acknowledge that ea is necessary for life and the political independence is necessary for the well-being of the Hawaiian people, much work remains in the way of disseminating this fact. Moreover, there exists the more difficult task of winning over non-Hawaiians to support Hawaiians in pursuit of ea. Even as non-Hawaiians might conceptually understand the fundamental truth of a declaration like ea is the environment that sustains life for humans, or even that ea of Hawaii is its independent government, there remains the bundled questions of what is and what should be the relationship of non-Hawaiians to Ea, or the relationship of non-Hawaiians to Hawaiian self-determination. What follows then takes seriously the need to pierce the air of inevitability that surrounds US political ascendancy in Hawai'i. And insofar as it can still be difficult to imagine viable alternatives, I present instances of non-Hawaiians who partnered in exemplary ways with Hawaiians in pursuit of Ea. In contending with the relative lack of examples of this sort, I present the stories and experiences of 13 interviewees who help answer the question, what should or what ought to be the role of non-Hawaiians in Hawaiian movement? In wrestling with the difficulties of moral suasion, I also address two related questions. In what ways did non-Hawaiians behave ethically in their conduct with Hawaiians? And how might non-Hawaiians today learn to act ethically in similar ways? So building off of that, I will roll into the second dot here. I don't know why that first dot was oddly situated. But my argument, and this is like I've tried to emphasize it, I think so far, this is the working argument. This is the one that continues to undergo revision as the rest of the dissertation continues to take shape. So in review of the interviews collected for this project, I argue that there are at least three ways in which we can understand ethical conduct for settlers in Hawai'i. Through effective discharge of one's professional duties in partnership with Kanaka in their protection of Aina. 2, through sustained and intentional relationship building with Aina and Kanaka in the service of Aina and Hawaiian communities. And 3, through a clear defiance of settler authority alongside Kanaka and an assumption of personal risk. In the course of articulating the three above understandings of ethical conduct for settlers in Hawai'i, I posit that settler colonialism as a system is unethical because it expropriates Aina and subjugates Kanaka. As I later explain in more detail, to be a settler does not in and of itself entail that one is unethical. As an identity defined by its relationship to indigenous peoples in a settler state, a settler may or may not identify with and participate in the US settler state, whether through inertia, cynicism, or the aggressive assault on Hawaiian rights and self-determination. Indeed, it's possible to be a settler without fully acknowledging the existence of the historically rooted land-centered projects requiring constant effort to marginalize and extinguish indigenous connections so as to secure control of land. That is, it's possible to be a settler without fully acknowledging the existence of settler colonialism. Once again, following analysis of those interviewed for this study, I contend that while settlers should acknowledge the existence of settler colonialism, such an acknowledgement is not a prerequisite for ethical settler conduct. While certainly a familiarity with the geographically specific structures of settler colonialism here would better facilitate ethical conduct, the interviewees of this study prove that it's possible to act ethically without this knowledge, and in more than a few cases without using the term settler colonialism. In fact, a majority of the settlers in this study did not and do not embrace the specific language of settler colonialism, in part out of the perception that it is a narrowly academic concept. Others question the term's utility based on the belief that it misrepresented the condition of the settler. Wrestling with the proper place of the language of settler colonialism, I deem it to be a useful tool in accurately capturing the political environment in Hawai'i, especially as it pertains to Kanaka Oiwi. And if we have time, there is a little bit more that I'd like to say about this. Not only the language of settler colonialism itself, the use of the term, its kind of disputed use amongst interviewees, and the kind of perception of its disputed use in the larger community, but also a few reflections on the relationship of the academy to the world that exists outside of the academy, insofar as those can be thought of as kind of separate realms. So as the settler state of Hawai'i seeks to rid the land of collective native presence and permanence in order to make way for and legitimize settler society, this situation of colonial domination is a structural condition that requires a structural remedy. In the very least, such a structural remedy would include the cessation of the unjust power relation. For settlers striving to act ethically in a colonial situation characterized by structural injustice, there emerges two related questions in what address of this unjust power relation looks like and how settlers can contribute to this address. While some proponents of federal or state recognition assert that a just relationship between the US and Hawaii is possible, Kanaka and settlers alike overwhelmingly rejected this option proposed as recently as 2014, based in large part on the conclusion that recognition would not substantively improve the lives of Kanaka. The issue of recognition poses an important example of the ways in which ethical actions for settlers is tied up with ostensibly political matters. Should a settler have advocated for federal recognition in 2014, that position could have been deemed ethical only if the multiple arguments decrying the pitfalls of FedRec were satisfactorily addressed. For settlers then, it's important to be familiar with such political matters in order to determine an ethical course of action. Ultimately, my argument upholds three types of ethical engagements by settlers participating in the early stages of the modern Hawaiian movement, characterized more by processes undertaken than the specific positions they adopted. To be sure, the example of the more radically inclined activists emerge as an especially laudatory form of ethical engagement, in no small part because of explicit positions these activists adopted in opposition to capitalism. Yet, I uphold a diversity of ethical types, both out of an attempt to capture the ways in which an ecosystem of settler engagement with the incipient Hawaiian movement existed in the mid-1970s and 1980s, and to suggest a continuum of approaches available to settlers today who might learn from the examples presented. Excuse me for a second. Okay, so if we're following my bullets here, we're now in the method that you see has an asterisk. And the reason for that is because of, I would say, a problem or an opportunity that arose in the course of my research that I'll touch upon in a few ways, and then I will reflect upon with you today. And in a lot of ways, the method became my way of thinking through my own kind of ethical engagements as a researcher, and then reflecting back on the sort of ethical commitments that I hold or want to hold in relation to Hawaiians and Hawaiian movement. And it was one of those things where the further I got along, the more inclined I was to revisit the beginning. And there is a way in which it kind of looked like I was stuck. And part of my revision process now is thinking through how to represent this part of my process, which became integral to the analysis itself, without it seeming like, you know, a wheel stuck in mud, and to make it sort of provocative and generative and something that somebody else could engage in without recognizing or identifying this as being self-indulgent, which is something that I was sort of always wary about when introducing myself into the project itself. So I will get into that, I think, a little bit later. But in any case, I'll talk through my method, and then I will get into some of the difficulties that I encountered. So an interdisciplinary method drives this project's research design. While drawing from a diversity of archival sources and engaging in a variety of theoretical approaches, personally conducted interviews sit at its metaphorical heart. Over the course of nearly 2 years, I conducted over a dozen interviews with participants in the land use and anti-eviction struggles that began in the 1970s. These interviews represented the culmination of a thorough but certainly not exhaustive effort to connect with members of a multifaceted community, some 50 years removed from that historical moment which tenuously linked them together. Previous to identifying potential interviewees, I familiarized myself with existing research on the land use and anti-eviction struggles that began in the 1970s in Hawaii. This process entailed a review of secondary literature on the multiple overlapping campaigns of that time, including scholarly treatments as well as daily newspaper accounts. Understanding the political leanings of this archive of secondary literature allowed me to identify which settlers I might seek out as potential moral exemplars of settler decolonization in Hawaii from the era of the burgeoning modern Hawaiian movement. After reviewing Oahu's 2 daily newspapers from the mid-20th century, as well as existing scholarship leading up to and through the community-based movements of the 1970s, including the groundbreaking essay by Haunani K. Trask, The Birth of the Modern Hawaiian Movement, Mass and Mass Autobiography of Protests in Hawaii, and Noelani Goodyear Kaupua's co-edited volume, Nation Rising, Hawaiian Movements for Life, Land, and Sovereignty, I began culling primary documents related to the struggles in Kalama, Waiahole, Waikane, and Kaho'olawe. Beginning with archived community journals and newspapers like the Hawaii Observer and the Hawaii Pono Journal, I broadened my scope to include the University of Hawaii's Save Our Surf collection, or SOS collection, in its library. The preliminary survey of primary and secondary research yielded an initially hazy picture of the political landscape of the 1970s, including key individuals and the organizations with which they were affiliated. As I began to reach out to and spend time with potential interviewees, a clearer picture of the multifaceted ecosystem of activists and advocates emerged. From John Kelly's SOS to Marxist-Leninists and sometimes Marxist-Leninist Maoist study groups, religiously affiliated Youth Action, the Hawaii Satellite for the National Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and the founding members of the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Hawaiʻi, the archive uncovered a vibrant scene of political organizing populated largely by working class youth. Broadly speaking, the existing literature on 1970s political organizing forwarded one of 2 perspectives. On the one hand, texts like Trask's The Birth of the Modern Hawaiian Movement and the more recently published A Nation Rising sought to trace ongoing efforts at Kanaka Maoli's self-determination through to the pivotal movement building actions of the 1970s. On the other hand, the uncollated published accounts of non-Hawaiians involved in political organizing during the same time period tended toward a working class analysis. To be fair, those texts foregrounding Kanaka self-determination did not do so to the exclusion of non-Kanaka participants. Trask's origin story of the modern Hawaiian movement, for example, identifies John Wittick from the first group of students to answer the call for support issued by the residents of Kalama Valley in their eviction struggle. Similarly, texts like Mass and Mass Autobiography of Protests in Hawaii and the 1999 retrospective on the founding of the University of Hawaii's Ethnic Studies Department in Social Process in Hawaii juxtapose these 2 perspectival tendencies, and occasionally featured more intersectional accounts that broached, for instance, the relating of the anti-war struggle to community and Hawaiian issues. Thus, as there does not exist a complete lack of scholarly address on the topic of non-Hawaiian participation in what Trask calls the birth of the modern Hawaiian movement, this project's proposed intervention relates to its framing and focus. Directing an ethical lens on the actions of non-Hawaiians who participated in the fledgling modern Hawaiian movement, this project required a new archive, one exclusively dedicated to those non-Hawaiian actors. As I lingered over the interviews, the archival materials on 1970s political movements transitioned in purpose. While at the outset, those materials helped me to identify and eventually make contact with those individuals who appeared to espouse sympathy for Hawaiian self-determination, they later served the purpose of filling in the blanks of memory or filling out the details of faint recollections. As I shall detail in the count and appraisal of the interviews that follow, significant variation attended the means by which I became acquainted with each interviewee. Generally speaking, my adaptive approach included making contact with potential interviewees through an intermediary with whom I was previously acquainted. Often, consenting interviewees would offer themselves as intermediaries of their own accord, especially when I discussed my commitment to relationship building or otherwise communicated this common means of facilitating my study. Thus, while the included schedule of of questions remained a constant point of focus throughout. That's my interview questions. The interview process itself entailed a concerted effort far exceeding the rattling off of sequential queries. Grounding its purpose in Indigenous resurgence, this project methodologically hews to what Linda Tuhiwai-Smith refers to as the ethic of reciprocity. Committing to Smith's assertion regarding the necessity of decolonization in the process of research, I attempt to uphold Smith's holistic notion of decolonization. Rejecting research possibilities that are extractive, I attempt to perpetually answer in the affirmative the question of whether this research serves to forward decolonial efforts for Kanaka Waiwi in Hawaii. Through critical analysis of the conducted interviewees, I synthesize a portrait of the settlers who participated in these struggles, inclusive of the values they held and enacted in partnership with Kanaka Waiwi. In order to draw out the ethical lessons that may be learned from the settlers in relationship with Kanaka Waiwi during political and social struggle, I frame a decolonial settler ethics that draw in large part from, and I don't need to get into, I think, what turns out to be a kind of lit review of how I assembled my kind of ethical lens. That's something that I can talk about more if you're interested, but it turns out to be a somewhat kind of specialized look into the theory behind my ethical approach. So I'll skip this part, which explains that, and then I'll leave you with sort of the conclusion of this segment. So in the course of this study, I attempt provisional answers to a number of questions regarding just what was distinct about decolonial efforts in Hawaii that began in the 1970s. These questions include the following. To what extent was organizing at this time different from previous efforts driven by class interests? And to what extent did non-Hawaiians get involved in order to address the legacies of colonialism in Hawaii? Additionally, I attempt provisional answers to questions about the enduring lessons to be gleaned from decolonial efforts in Hawaii during the 1970s. For instance, were any traits shared in common by the settlers involved? Were there any similarities between the organizations that successfully facilitated settler involvement? Finally, I explore the ways in which we might answer methodologically and philosophically oriented questions, such as the following. How do we properly frame the contributions of settlers to decolonial movement building? How should the ethical sensibilities of settlers today be informed by the exemplary acts of settlers beginning in the 1970s in Hawaii? Okay, so I will pause there for a second because what follows is the asterisk. So a few things happened in the course of my research, and then as I made my way towards trying to write. I think the most prominent being the second kind of engagement between Hawaiian and state forces over the building of the 30-meter telescope, the proposed building, and this pandemic. And alongside like this, I was also kind of sitting with this rapidly accumulating archive of interviews and returning to and trying to make my way through the archive. I was stalled multiple times. Sometimes life got in the way, sometimes kind of the political activities of the settler state, we'll say, got in the way. And sometimes it really was kind of inherent to the study itself. And as I sat with the archive, I think I basically was just overwhelmed by the responsibility of carrying these people's stories. And what I did one day was pick up a book that was completely, what I thought was completely unrelated to my project. I was not even necessarily looking for inspiration at the time. I think I was just trying to find a way to keep my mind going as I tried to process. And as it turns out, like, this is an appropriate place to share what exactly happened. When John was introducing, my first engagement with the biography office was through Craig Howe's and the Value of Hawaii 2 project that was co-edited by Aiko Yamashiro and Noelani Goodyear Kaupua. Craig's other co-editor for the first volume of the Value of Hawaii was John Osorio. And in a lot of ways, the reason why I found myself back in Hawaii, first teaching in the public school system and then back in grad school, was because of a sort of chance encounter with John that became a more intentional kind of cultivated relationship, where basically I tracked him down and basically asked him to teach me beyond the class that I took with him, and it since turned into kind of mentor-mentee relationship and a friendship. And if Craig reviews the tape, this may or may not be true, but I think one of the reasons why I came to mind as a person on the slate this semester was because of a chance interaction, sort of, where John was involved and Craig was catching up with me and asking, "What are you up to again? What's your project on?" And I briefly described it, and I think it sort of resonated as a biography sort of project. So that's the first part is sort of John and finding my way back here. The second thing is the book itself. So I'll read this. I'll read this thing that I wrote after reflecting on that book. So actually, it'll sound like I'm talking about John's book, but I'll get to the second book in a second. So in the preface to his landmark study on the colonial incursions faced by the Hawaiian nation during the late 19th century, Kanakaʻiwi scholar Jonathan K. Kamakawiwaʻole Osorio asks and answers a methodological and stylistic question about his text. So what sort of mo'olelo is this? It's the only one I can tell. In the book's concluding chapter, Osorio offers the following gloss for the Olelo Hawaiʻi word mo'olelo. In English, mo'olelo translates as history, story, tale, folktale, account. Literally, it means a fragment of a story, as though the teller recognizes that he is not saying everything there is to say about the subject. Speaking of the chosen topic of his published work, Osorio declares, I cannot pretend to say everything there is to say about it. I do not even try to say everything I know about the subject, but all that I do know is only a small part of the truth. This is a fragmented history, story, and account of non-Hawaiians who entered in ethical relationship with Hawaiians between the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. It's personalized in such a way that I confidently declare it to be the only one I can tell. That's not to say that I claim to be the only one who ought to relate what follows, nor would I confidently declare that what I have created is a mo'olelo. The primacy of so many other life stories and my own positionality as a non-Hawaiian who does not even approach fluency in Olelo Hawaii preclude such claims. To be clear, I do not explicitly name my involvement in this study as a means of claiming intellectual property. In fact, I generally hold a strong aversion to self-aggrandizement, especially as it pertains to the academy. The imperative to account for myself in this project emerged as I began to listen to, interpret, and critically situate the many hours of personal stories that my interview questions prompted. Time and again, my digital recordings transported me back to the specific circumstances surrounding the interviews. In spite of a rather modest setup in which I deployed a cardioid microphone supported by a tripod wired to my laptop, the recordings picked up much more than the words uttered by my interviewees. Often, I closed my eyes and in near reverie visualized a given conversation's mise en scène. I marveled at the life bursting through in the recordings, the spontaneous digressions that interviewees pursued, and the pregnant silences that would inevitably confound representation. For a number of months, what I had anticipated to be a straightforward process, analyzing my recordings, led me to an impasse. Daunted by the awesome responsibility of carrying the personal stories entrusted with me, I tarried over their subsequent address. After multiple attempts at timestamp transcription and notation, I finally landed on a method of both textually rendering the spoken words of my interviewees and sketching my impressions that allowed me to refer back to the recorded source material. The delay that ensued was largely a result over a question of representation. Any attempt to capture the fullness of each interviewee became doomed by an ever-widening gap between my words and the denotated and connotated truths I hoped they would capture. Laboring under the duty to properly represent the people I interviewed with honesty, complexity, and beauty, I encountered a text that offered a way forward. Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, provided guidance where I feared none could be offered. Less prototype and more inspiration, Hartman's moving text literally stirred me to action when I was stymied in my writing process. Engaging with the painful legacy of the middle passage through radical authorial honesty, Hartman's autoethnography draws a delicate balance between self-disclosure and self-discovery, historical narrative and historiography. I was simultaneously devastated and uplifted upon reading the exceedingly forthright Hartman declare. My graduate training hadn't prepared me to tell the stories of those who had left no record of their lives and whose biography consisted of the terrible things said about them or done to them. So there's no true analogy between that experience and the experience of my interviewees. It's, like I said, it's method. It's the way that Saidiya Hartman could work through that archive and still find a way to bring something together. So basically my feeling was, if she could do that, what am I really complaining about? So Hartman's reference to her graduate training did not register as an admission of regret or an accusation of negligence. It was simply an acknowledgement of Hartman's position before a task she was determined to undertake, even as it elicited a question about the very way forward. It was self-inventory as starting point, as method. Evading traditional genre boundaries, Hartman proved that a story, what she calls slippery at the edges, need not paralyze a writer or entail writing inaccessible to readers. As I shall further detail an explication of this project's methodology, my interdisciplinary approach draws inspiration from a diverse array of sources, yet its rhetorical embrace of transparency with regard to my positionality owes much to Hartman's exemplary text. What follows then is my humble attempt at an ethics of non-Hawaiian relationality, admittedly fragmentary and intensely personal. Okay, so we have made our way to the last bullet point here. And what I offer now are some fragments. I think I've done a lot to set up what the project is. And to this point, I think most of my revisions around its framing are in a place where I can turn my attention to the analysis, the body chapters themselves. And so I'll offer a few fragments of that, and then I'll try to leave a lot of time for engagement with you folks. And I'm not sure if it's possible, but it would be great if we could even turn on cameras and have something of a conversational dialogue that doesn't just look like me talking to myself in a void. So the first fragment 1. While somewhat anticipated during this project's research design stage, the language divide between the academy and the everyday world of my interviewees proved salient from the first informal conversation I initiated. If most of those engaged as potential interviewees were familiar with the term settler colonialism, rarely was this term positively appraised. As it turned out, I was rarely the one to raise the topic. Potential interviewees, often towards the end of our first in-person conversation, and nearly in passing, would broach the subject by either offering their opinion or posing a question. Typically, those opinions looked unfavorably at the analytic of settler colonialism, out of its mystification as a scholarly theory, or its implication of the unknowingly complicit. Interestingly, I found potential interviewees who I met later in my research process to be increasingly familiar with the concept of settler colonialism and more likely to bring it up. Yet, in spite of its apparent circulation, even those conversations undertaken in the latter 2010s tended to cast the concept as inimical. Where interviewees were willing to explore their sentiments regarding settler colonialism, we invariably landed on the ways in which the analytic insisted on the primary distinction between indigenous and settler. My settler interviewees occupied a range of positionalities. In some cases, no considerable discussion about identity was necessary to discover this fact. Yet, to a person, challenges to the analytic of settler colonialism centered around a simple plea. The settlers wanted to be understood, or that settlers should be understood in their complexity. Certainly, there seemed to be an element of defensiveness embedded in this plea. Nevertheless, my commitment to honor the voices of my interviewees demanded that I wrestle with the following question: whence settler colonialism? What to do with it? As with any scholar that engages individuals without abiding ties to the academy, I attempted to uphold the standards of my discipline while balancing a commitment to those featured in this work. That research for this project has entailed a considerable amount of time spent with the people who appear in its written product. I resolved to write something that they will find to be legible. More importantly, I resolved to write something in which my interviewees will recognize themselves. Prudence around deployment of the term settler colonialism thus serves as a microcosm to the macrocosm that entails balance between the dictates of the academy on the one hand and the reality of the interviewees on the other. I think we're in a place where in the academy and the larger community, we aren't just looking at a definition of settler colonialism. We're looking to engage with it. We're looking to pull it apart. We're looking to question it and to find what's useful about it and possibly discard what's not. And I think having the title settler in my project signals its belonging to a certain kind of conversation. And what I'm trying to say here, which is kind of plucked from the middle of a chapter, is it's difficult to use a term when the people that kind of comprise your archive, if that's what they are, sometimes reject the term, want to question it, want it to be something of an unsettled point, right? And so I think we use language as scholars to indicate, right, our belonging to a certain kind of conversation, while at the same time, oftentimes it's a specialized language and one, unfortunately, I think that's insulated from a broader world, and it can be imposing to assume that the language that's coherent to a scholarly conversation can easily apply to a world. And now I know we're getting into sort of some of the difficulties of language, and so I'll pause on that for a second. I anticipate that there may be more questions about this in our question and answer section. So the next two parts before I open things back up, I will do quickly, but hopefully with justice. And the first is a fragment from my chapter on Luigi or Gigi Copio. He affectionately is referred to as Father Gigi. So Father Gigi described himself as a guest to the predominantly Hawaiian community of Makaha, while simultaneously emphasizing a commitment to being rooted. That he has lived in Hawaii for over 40 years suggests a conceptualization of guest as a static identity, closely approximating that of settler. By contrast, the quality of being rooted was forwarded as a dynamic aspect of his identity, something that could be cultivated through intentional effort. This two-pronged self-description, and I refer here to another part of the chapter, emerged as part of a story Father Gigi shared about urban interlopers who sought to impose their plans in Waianae. Father Gigi suggests that witnessing developers from Honolulu attempt to foist unsolicited plans on leeward Oahu communities allowed Father Gigi to articulate his notion of the guest. Father Gigi characterized this notion of the guest by a marked commitment to transience. These are his words. You're a guest and you can support, you can be present. And I always say, look, I'm ready to go anytime. When somebody say we can take over, you can go. I'm ready to go anytime. Father Gigi's conception of the guest was preceded by a period of reflective observation that started upon his arrival in Hawaii. this productive withdrawal, or what he called time to digest, when Father Gigi, this is him again, tried to respect the culture, not to say too many things, not to give away or not to give any advice to anybody, not to give any suggestion. In turn, was informed by Father Gigi's previous experience in the Philippines. Father Gigi arrived in the Tondo district during the authoritarian reign of Ferdinand Marcos, without facility in the common language of that region. Regarding the 4 months that it took for Father Gigi to learn the language, during another period of productive withdrawal that he called the meantime, Father Gigi lent the instruction that you just look around and you listen. The impulse to look around and listen was not a natural one, according to him. Initially, as he was learning Tagalog, Father Gigi attempted to establish a regular Bible study. While the idea was well received, a rapid decline in attendance, him again, first night 40 people, second night 20, third night 10, fourth night 0, led Father Gigi to reevaluate his approach as a community-based priest. Passing over his first thought, which attributed a lack of interest to his poor Tagalog, Father Gigi arrived at the conclusion that intellectualism was to blame. In explanation of his conceptualization of ineffective intellectualism, that's a mouthful, Father Gigi referenced his observation of a troubling dynamic that existed between intellectuals and Tondo residents. Father Gigi noted that in an atmosphere of widespread social protest, many university students made their way to poor communities wielding a jargon-heavy analysis. As Father Gigi described, they would come from outside. They would come to the slum area to teach about imperialism, all these kinds of words. And people would come to me and say, hey, Father Gigi, what's imperialism? What's colonialism? If Father Gigi was suspicious of this sort of intellectualism, he was not altogether opposed to the analysis indexed by the terms the university students were using. As Father Gigi explained, these are the right concepts, but they are concepts. These community members didn't have anything to eat. You have to start where people are. Having doubts about the usefulness of concepts to those in need of food, Father Gigi then resolved, for 1 year, every night, to go stay with the people. Speaking of that year in the second person before switching back to the first person, he continued, you sit down and listen to them. Talk to me. And I think I should pause there so that we can do the second fragment of Auntie Gwen. Auntie Gwen insists that her memory has begun to falter. Just as John Whittick and Ed Greevy have impressed upon me the importance of recording their stories given their advanced age, Auntie Gwen's is a common refrain that suggests the complications of memory and the sheer chronological distance that stands between the contemporary moment and the events and relationships I asked to be assessed. I met Auntie Gwen at the public launch of Gary Kubota's Hawai'i Stories of Change. I'll skip a little bit and say something about what happened. As I hung towards the back of the makeshift stage that Gary had created inside Halea'o, I was greeted by the silent eyebrow raise of acknowledgement by John Whittick. John really seemed to have taken to heart the charge of serving as a collaborator to my research. I slowly walked to him, standing near, and whispered hello as I waited in the line that had assembled before Gary Kubota. John was one of several people to forward an invitation to the event, and he signaled his delight at my attendance by drawing me into an embrace. I'm glad you made it, said John. I'm glad to introduce you to everybody here. I'm skipping a little bit, and then when I later made my way over to what had become an ad hoc potluck spread, I chuckled upon discovering 3 types of fried chicken and a lineup of Zippy's chili buckets so deep that the self-appointed food arrangers betrayed a visible frustration at the abundance that threatened to spill over the edges of the picnic table. Assembled on this table was a veritable cornucopia of raw and prepared dishes. Standing in front of a little portion of the table informally designated for kalo, I marveled at the bounty of wisdom and nourishment on offer at this Saturday afternoon, held before the majestic backdrop of the Ko'olau mountain range. Auntie Gwen did not strike me as frail, even as she sat framed against a support pillar in the lanai abutting Halea'o, apologizing to friends who approached her in greeting for her inability to stand for a hug. Before John could offer to introduce us, I knelt beside Auntie Gwen to introduce myself. It was in part my reading of the deference with which others were approaching Auntie Gwen, and perhaps an intuition about the racial and gender difference between the two elders. But I wanted to fully shape my side of our first introduction. My experience in other community work taught me of the importance of introductions, and guided by honed instinct, I proceeded on my own rather than wait to be connected by John. Hi, Auntie. I want to introduce myself to you because I have a lot of appreciation for you and have been encouraged to talk story with you. So I've been nervous many times in my life before, including at the beginning of today's talk, but there's nothing that resembles the uncertainty and fear that accompanies approaching an elder, as some of you will know. It's unlike the aversion to embarrassment or rejection one might experience as nervousness in other situations. The nervousness before a revered elder is the anxiety of influence physically manifested. A vast discrepancy in life experience invests a younger party with a sense of unworthiness. As a younger party, one can only hope that curiosity and patience prevail in the elder, along with a healthy tendency towards disclosure. Of course, these elements were not detectable in equal measure in all the elders I encountered, but they were characteristics that reliably predicted a willingness to be interviewed and an openness to relationship building. Upon my introduction, Auntie Gwen responded with a look of incredulity. Were her vocalized expression to be transcribed, its closest literal representation would be, hmm? She wanted to know if I was sure that I knew who she was. I assured her that I knew something about her and that others had encouraged me to get to know her before proceeding to explain that I was attempting a study of non-Hawaiians like her involved in the eviction struggles of the 1970s in Hawaii. Auntie Gwen seemed intrigued by my project. With the benefit of hindsight, I can confirm that Auntie Gwen was especially interested in discussing the complexities of class and racial identity with regard to the social justice scene in 1970s Hawaii. So too was Auntie Gwen interested in my attraction to and development of my project. Owing to the steady stream of fellow book launch attendees who wanted to visit with her, however, I imagined a running clock that would limit the amount of time I could talk with Auntie Gwen on that day. I communicated my desire not to monopolize her time, and she immediately drew out her phone, anticipating my request to reconnect. We exchanged phone numbers, and Auntie Gwen exhorted me to call her immediately while noting her busy schedule as a regular caretaker. Clearing an hour in my schedule, I rang Auntie Gwen on a weekday afternoon and expected to leave a message while providing a brief schedule of my availability. While she did not pick up, she began a text message thread to establish a time when we could talk on the phone. I was grateful for Auntie Gwen's clear interest in speaking with me, as well as her explanation of her narrow availability. In other attempts to foster relationships with potential interviewees for my project, I was occasionally left wondering after unsuccessful attempts to connect. In time, I grew not to immediately interpret these failed attempts as indication of disapproval or even disinterest in my project. Yet, I closely scrutinized my exchanges with potential interviewees, and especially those first correspondences, out of respect both for the aforementioned discrepancy in life experience and for the instincts of these elders. As is the case with community-engaged scholarship, I understood that it was one thing to have my dissertation project vetted at an early stage by my dissertation committee, and that it was quite a different proposition to have my project be validated by the interests of interview subjects. And with that, I will end my fragmented presentation of where my dissertation research stands at the moment in the middle of its revisions, and I guess turn it back over to our hosts, who I think will facilitate some exchange with those who are here who are interested.
Thank you so much, Logan. Yes, so we'll move to the question and answer portion. John will be moderating. At any point, you can put your questions into the chat. And if you'd like to have something more interactive, like Logan suggested, you can raise your hand and John will call on you and will unmute you and turn your video on. So you can ask a question directly or share a comment. Just know that you may be a part of the recording, and that would mean you agree to be part of our archive and part of the YouTube video.
Okay, great. Thank you, Logan. That was completely engaging, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions for you. We did have one come in anonymously, and I'll start with that one. It's a question about terminology. It's to do with your use of the words Kanaka Uivi and settler. And the question is, in your pool of interviewees, is the dividing line between native Hawaiians and all others, or are descendants of Hawaiian Kingdom citizens from non-native Hawaiian ancestry considered by you as Kanaka Uivi?
I think I can only speak of those I interviewed, and none of them identified themselves as descendants of citizens of the Hawaiian Kingdom. But I'm trying to think if we even came close to that conversation or the discussion. I think it often came up, and I imagine this is the occasion for the question. It often came up in the context of problematizing the kind of settler-indigenous dichotomy. But because none of them at least identified themselves as descendants of the kingdom or of citizens of the kingdom, there were no occasions on which the interviewees would say, you know, I would prefer that you call me X, Y, or Z. So my terminology, I think, comes more from a contemporary kind of framework, one that insists on the dichotomy, the indigenous settler dichotomy, and identifies Kanaka Uivi as one amongst other names for indigenous Hawaiians, and settler as those who are not indigenous to Hawaii.
So we have not questions, but responses in the chat. Wonderful work, says Richard Rothschiller. Looking forward to the final Imua. So I'm looking for raised hands. I think you can find that function in the reactions button below on your screen. So please we're inviting questions. Logan, can I ask something while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions? I'm curious about your background in as a theology student, and this is a biographical kind of question, so I think it's appropriate. But in framing a sense of ethics, you know, that you're applying to these interviews, to these experiences that you're trying to understand and draw kind of an ethics from. Can you say something about how you come to that question, and whether the kinds of models for ethical reasoning that we inherit from Europe come into play with ways of thinking about being together, having things be right with each other that come from here? And how have you thought through different sort of ethical systems in relation to what you're doing in your project?
This was one of the questions kind of about theoretical framework that confounded from the start. If I were to draw from a, I guess for lack of a better word, like a Western tradition, that identified an ethical framework from a Western tradition and then applied it here, would that be appropriate? And then might it be more appropriate because I wasn't necessarily talking about people who weren't familiar with, or not to double negative, but I would be talking about people who I think it could be reasonably understood to have familiarity with the Western kind of tradition. If nothing else, they weren't, you know, indigenous to this place. And so another kind of related question, would it be appropriate to ascribe like a Hawaiian or an indigenous kind of ethical framework? So a lot of what I do is talk about the kind of the different types or the different ways of the interviewees making their way through their self-understanding. So the way that I organize the chapters, and again, under construction, but I think it'll hold up, is by broadly speaking, what I call a kind of tradition of settler engagement. And then in this tradition, I grouped individual interviewees together by, and this is a super oversimplification, but basically according to the urgency with which I think they want to basically overturn the settler state. And then also they're kind of standing as different professionals, I guess you would say, like the sort of day-to-day work that they engage in or used to engage in. And it turns out to be like a way of organizing them and grouping them together that makes a certain kind of sense. But somebody could look at my archive and say, like, these people like could be arranged with each other and actually are brought together by a different sort of like common ethical framework. So to answer your question, like, yeah.
So an organic approach rather than coming in with a predetermined framework.
Yeah.
So I want to get to some of the chat. Gwen Kim appreciates the internal processes the struggles went through. Kyo Pak is asking, have you reached some conclusions as to what are ethical behaviors of non-Hawaiians in the Hawaiian movement for justice?
Yes, and before I get to the question, that's the Antiguan that we shared a fragment of. So
oh, is it? Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah. Also embarrassed that you had to see like the work still under construction. In part, the reason why I didn't fully invite everybody, because these are still undergoing revision and sort of vetting by the larger academic community. But the question, I think, is the one that that is the crux of my revision. Like, what are the conclusions? And part of what you probably saw today is my anxiety about boiling down the complexity of people into conclusions. Not to say that I don't understand that this is where everything is headed, but how to talk about people and then have an ethical conversation. And I think oftentimes the expectation is sort of rules for conduct, like a moral code that we might distill. And I'm reluctant to do it. I think I'm going to do a version of it, like in the conclusion that will be rewritten. But I think some of it came out like as I was setting up the project today. And then some of it is indicated by the way I've grouped folks together. So I think one of the things is acknowledgement. And as I said before, like, acknowledgement of the condition of settler colonialism doesn't mean that you have to acknowledge or you have to accept the term. The more important thing is you accept responsibility for engaging with it, right? And it's so difficult to talk about structures because they're invisible. But I said something along the lines of like a structural problem requires a structural response. So basically, all of my people that were interviewed for this project, to a certain degree, understood the condition of Hawai'i as under kind of conditions of injustice structurally, that these weren't problems encountered by individual people who happen to call themselves Hawaiians. There was a pattern of injustice, and that the pattern of injustice needed to be addressed in such a way that you could remedy, at a structural level. So whether you're talking, I could get into the details, but basically you had people who were involved in land struggle, you had people who were involved in sort of working class or labor struggles, and they saw this as part of a larger movement to address structural conditions in Hawaii.
Great. So Shannon Pomaikai Hennessy says, mahalo for your work, Logan. I find the settler native binary useful too. I'm wondering why you've chosen to use it here, especially as so many of your interviewees are resistant to it.
It's a good question. It's one that's been raised. If we were to kind of characterize by majority or minority, it was actually the minority who were resistant to it. I think maybe half raise it as a question, but we're sure to say, like, it's not that I disagree with it. It's I want to know more, or if I disagree with it, it doesn't mean that I don't also see the value of it. And maybe there are one or two occasions where somebody said, I don't like that. And I, basically don't want it. And then still we would talk about it. And then the part that we don't like, we would then kind of broaden or open up into a conversation about. But I see these sorts of conversations as related, and there was no like kind of, and so therefore you're forbidden from using it or anything like that. Now, like in the larger pool of people that I approached who potentially were going to be part of the study, and who I did have like some interviews that were recorded, there were folks who said like, I don't like it. This isn't who I think of myself, and I choose not to identify and don't like it when people do. And I think that there's something interesting there. I even think there's a potential project in of itself, like that gets into like kind of the term and wrestling with like its appropriateness. It's sort of like a given for where a starting point for me, and so it wasn't necessarily an open question whether I would leave it behind.
So I'm going to jump a bit because some of the questions have to do with the terminology that you've addressed, and maybe we'll come back to them. Estelle Chun is asking, what was the interviewee's background? Where are they from originally, especially if not local? What was their ethnicity and generation in Hawaii, and why did they become interested in supporting Native Hawaiian rights? You got 13 of them, so you may maybe give an overview, just talking about what generally their backgrounds were.
Let me see if I can generalize. There was I'll answer it by kind of a snapshot into another interviewee. There was a part that I was thinking about including today, where I was setting up one of the interview subjects who happens to be a lawyer, a Japanese lawyer, who in a lot of ways was the archetypal interview subject when I was kind of abstractly thinking, who this? Okay, so let's back up for a second. What I was looking for, and I've described this in other places, were ethical ancestors. I looked at the kind of Hawaii of the early 2010s, understood there were structural issues here. I was beginning to familiarize myself with the language of settler colonialism, picked up Candice Fujikane's Asian settler colonialism, totally saw myself in that, that famous introduction, and then asked, what are we supposed to do with this? What's next? How am I supposed to kind of live my life that accounts for this searing kind of criticism of a certain kind of person, who family has been in Hawaii for several generations, often thinks of themselves as local, but sort of disconnected from Hawaiian movement, maybe sees that injustice occurred historically, probably doesn't understand that it's ongoing. And so I was starting to look around, asking other people pretty much informally, like, so have you read this? What should we do about it? A lot of like, not really, or I don't know, people who shared my particular background. And so my response was like, I would like to go look for people historically who have experience with this. And maybe by talking story with them, it wasn't even like I want to make a project out of it. It was for my own personal learning, kind of attaching themselves to my genealogy, right? My ethical ancestors that could inform how I live my life. And then over time, it became a project as people were like, we like telling our story. We think that it's important because we also want to hear from other folks from that time who we remember, and sort of encouragement to make this the project. But then I couldn't find that many who shared my Japanese background. there was one like for a very long time. And so over time it broadened and broadened. The other part of it was people often introduced me to their friends. So I know you want me to answer the question simply. There weren't that many folks who were Japanese. There were a few who maybe were what we call local, basically people of color who have some genealogical tie to this or generational tie to Hawaii. But a lot were also like kind of first generation from the continent. We call them Haole, they call themselves Haole, who joined movement in their young kind of college years. So I would say half we're in that group.
So at this point in the proceedings, we always tell people that it's actually after a quarter after. Some of you have places to go, classes, meetings. So thank you all for coming. We will hang out, and if Logan is willing to address some more questions, we'll certainly do that. But we want to let you know that it's okay to jump out if you have other plans. But we'll continue asking questions. And Logan, are you okay hanging out for a little bit longer?
Happy to stick around.
Great. Okay. So I'm looking for I'm just going to jump a bit here. Some of them are comments. I've got a question from Richard Rothschiller. How do you conceptualize the Hawaiian/settler binary vis-a-vis class solidarity under global capitalism?
The best kind of way of working through this were with people who identified or continue to identify with MLM thought, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist thought. They either used to or continue to see a class analysis as the sort of prism through which one understands structural conditions, and an oversimplification that sometimes they would say is class above all else. And so the best way to create solidarity is solidarity across class lines. And in like the kind of Marxist formulation, like the problem of today is the problem of class struggle, basically. And so one of the things that these folks would talk about and cite kind of a historical conversation that continues today is there's a way or a version of the Hawaiian movement that looked to them like what MLM folks called narrow nationalism, a kind of ethnic identity or racial identity that transcended class solidarity and at the kind of the threat of class solidarity. And so no true revolution could happen if one chose ethnic or racial solidarity over class solidarity. And that was like it's a really hard thing to work through. And I think though that what I heard from those folks specifically who talked about like the impact of MLM thought was that being in Hawaii, being in community, one understands that there is something else going on, that racism and classism are interlinked. And so it's more of a matter of how you balance out your kind of your intersectionality, even if they didn't use that word, how you balance out your intersectional analysis. It's it's more of a matter of precision than it is of a choice of one over the other. Yeah, calibration.
So Logan, Christina Bakilega has asked me to condense her comment in the chat and to pose her question. So she says, after some praise, I like how you presented your focus on settlers in Hawaii as seeking to benefit Hawaiians and Hawaiian sovereignty. Since settler colonialism has benefited as a framework Hawaiians and other Native people, does this consideration play a role in your discussions with your interviewees? I also like your approach to relationships that emerge and change through conversations and actions. They are complex. In my view, both in academics and life, that means there is room for some respectful disagreement, even as you admire their ethics.
I think yes. To answer it simply, the question is, since Sedgwick has benefited, does this consideration play a role in your discussion with your interviewees? Yeah, I think, and actually, this was something that needs to still be negotiated. So I think part of the resistance or the questioning of settler colonialism is similar to the kind of class solidarity versus racial solidarity, and understanding Hawaiian movement as like a kind of race-based movement. And so resolving that tension means pointing out that there may be some advocates for kind of race-based self-determination or sovereignty, and there are also many more, in my opinion, like the overwhelming majority are those that don't advocate for kind of race-based position. The other kind of difficulty that I work through that I think is I don't know yet. I'm still trying to figure out. It's when I think the idea of deference like is factoring in, and that Hawaiian self-determination means that the kind of project of Hawaiian self-determination means being dictated by Hawaiian people and Hawaiian values, and right, the valuation of Hawaiian land in ways that might not be commonly shared. And so having differing visions of maybe a Hawai'i or Hawaii that's self-determined is different from saying you have a vision of Hawaii that's kind of achieving Hawaiian self-determination. And so I guess in some ways it does go back to the problem of race, right? Like in the example, what I imagine what's happening, so a lot of it is sort of subtext. What I imagine is happening, and some people who weren't included in this because they had somewhat inflammatory things to say, basically don't want to see themselves in a democratic kind of arrangement or an undemocratic arrangement. They believe that a just society is an egalitarian, a democratic one. And so if you're deferring to a group of people, even if it's kind of because of long-standing relationship to this place, basically indigenous people, that would confound a democratic kind of society. So what would it mean to advocate for a democratic future if it meant that I always have to give final say to people who are from here? And that like is something I'm still working out, how to talk about that, and not, I think there's a way that it makes it seem that people are almost racist, like because they don't care for listening to people based on race. It's not something that I've resolved yet.
Why don't we take one more question? Logan, is that okay?
Yep.
But I want to note before we move on to a question that Gwen in the chat has affirmed a healthy dialectic between academics and grassroots being critical to the advancement of the movement. So I just wanted to note that. I think important comment on the whole conversation. I'm going to ask a question from Kevin Akiyama. From a racial social justice lens, have you considered that non-Hawaiian settlers may reject the term settler because of their fragility, being that settlers have a higher power status over the minority Native Hawaiians here in Hawaii? You may have heard this term deriving from white fragility.
Yeah, and this is so related, right? Everybody I interviewed is ethical. My challenge is to draw out what makes that so, and then also to represent it back to folks who will find some level of inspiration in their story. I don't want them to be exemplars in the sense that one imitates them. I don't think that I want copies. There's already this, kind of language in the chat. We love Auntie Gwen. I don't think that even we can ask her if she's still here, if she wants a copy of herself. I think she wants people, right? We should ask her if she's still here. It doesn't, maybe she's not. Oh, she is, if she's willing. But I'll take a different example. The other person was Father Gigi, who thinks of himself as a guest. I don't think that what he was saying is that, Logan, therefore you should think of yourself as a guest too. He would never in our conversation ever cross to the point where he's like, I think this, therefore you should think that. And in fact, even if I asked the question directly, not a single person answered it. Where oftentimes after we were kind of winding down, and I would say, any last kind of lessons for people today? It was always a kind of process question or process answer. You should, in the same way that I tried to understand what was happening at my time, you should plug in whatever seems appropriate to you, almost like across the board. It wasn't like I've always been wanting to say to the kids of this time that what you should really do is open up a farm in Makaha and rebel against the Catholic Church so that you can hold space for middle school students, because that is the way to act and behave in Hawaii. So yeah.
So I want to make sure if Auntie Gwen wants to respond to your question, we'll give her space and time to do that.
But we don't have to put her on the spot.
But if not, yeah, I want to put her on the spot. Just want to make sure that if you want to respond, you can. And I want to make sure, Logan, that you see Issei Matsumoto's reference to Quinn New Lee's concepts of unsettled and ugly socialities in the chat. Sorry if I didn't get to everyone's questions. I think it's probably good to wrap up at this point and to give a warm thanks to Logan for sharing his project and giving us so many stimulating things to think about.
Thanks to you, John and Zoe and Paige for holding this space.
Thanks to you, Logan. Best wishes, and we look forward to the other side of this project so we can all see it.
Thank you.